and welcome to this episode, Making Sense of the Divide and Leading Yourself Through It. I'm Wendy De Rosa. I'm so glad you're here. If you are watching this on YouTube, feel free to subscribe so you can get updates when I upload new videos. And if you're listening on Apple iTunes or another podcast platform, please feel free to like it and to leave a review. That helps other people find these episodes that might help them. So I'm so glad you're here, and we're going to dive into this topic. And initially, the topic was inspired by the recent election, and it's not really about the election. This is a great example of how we might experience a deep sense of divide between ourselves and others. But it's, this is one example of many that might feed into the complexity that occurs between ourselves and others when there is history, trauma, a lot of layers that we are processing and working through and living with. So, first of all, the divide can look like varying points of view, very opposing points of view, fundamentally different points of view where it feels like we are not even on the same plane and we don't even believe the same things. And ultimately, our values are different. What we value is different. And what can occur oftentimes, and where we feel that the most division is with the people we are closest to, or I should say it this way, where we feel the most pain in the division can be with the people we are most close to. And sometimes we can feel the pain of that divide when the holidays come around, or when we need to, sit at the table. There's that quote from Ram Dass, you think you're enlightened, go have a dinner with your family, and then all the stuff comes back up again, when we're in the same room with people that we love and we are, in close relationship with, or at least we have been in historical relationship with, and here we are figuring out how to get along when there's fundamental differences in people. So from a spiritual perspective, separation is one of our primal wounds. It's one of our primal pains. That separation or division, meaning separate from, is very fundamental down to incarnation, meaning once we come in to the human experience, we are already separate from oneness or from consciousness, from light, not consciousness, but we've separated from being immersed in the light into human form. And that in itself is one primal form of separation, is embodying and coming into this life. And then we individuate over time. I mean, not necessarily right away, but over time, we become an adult, we develop our own views. Even younger, in 6, 7, 8, we start to develop our own beliefs or our own life experiences. And as we evolve and age and grow, we develop our own beliefs and behaviors and ways of existing that are going to help us form bonds and relationships in our lives. So this is very fundamental in our existence. What happens when we experience, an election, or politics is a great example of it, because we have these parties, and these parties somewhat align on these different values. And currently, we don't know where that is. It's a blurred spectrum at this point, and there's a lot of crisscross through these these different party lines, we'll say. But ultimately, when someone we care about or love aligns to a particular party, it has different, it has an association and meaning. And that creates an experience of difference, differentiation, and divide. And so what happens here is that we start to, in a moment of understanding that someone's different than we are, they think differently, their values may be different, or we really don't know the reason why, but we have our association to, how we think and believe and what we think or believe about the other party, so to speak. There's a lot going on here, and the word is complex. And I want to break down that complexity a little bit more, because ideally, when we're talking about personal growth, spiritual growth, energy healing, and intuition, the conversation isn't about how is someone going to lead me through the divide. The conversation is, how am I going to lead myself through this level of division that I feel with this other person? Because if we're going to heal the divide, if we are ever going to, and there isn't even promises here, if we're ever going to heal it, the work isn't going to come from expecting the other person to do it. We ultimately need to heal the divide within ourselves, or at least heal the pain around it, so that we know how to be in relationship with ourselves in relation to the other person. So ultimately, what it comes down to is we're healing our own wounds, our own triggers, and our own experience of being in relationship with someone, anyone who feels differently than we do. Now, I'm saying all of this to say that I'm not justifying, inappropriate behaviors. I'm not justifying corruption. I'm not justifying harm to populations and to different people. I'm not saying any of that. I'm not justifying any of that. What I'm saying here, though, is that when we're sitting with pain about a division or about a separation or about other, we are sitting with the pain and we have to live with ourselves. And so it becomes our work and our personal responsibility to be able to do our part of that big puzzle. So I want to talk about that puzzle, because the puzzle, as I was saying a minute ago, is the complexity. And there are different words, different phrases for that complexity: complex trauma, complex history, complex emotions. There's a range of complexity that's going on, specifically when we're talking about a country, when we're talking about our own history or lineage or intergenerational experiences. We're talking about complexity around any matters that have history. And in this puzzle here, this big pie or puzzle, there's also been some standards, some normalizations, and some socially accepted behaviors, like shoving things under the rug, suppressing, shaming, blaming, the need to be right, making others wrong, not taking responsibility, not showing vulnerability, empathy, or compassion, not necessarily respecting another person's beliefs, culture, ways of existing, or really who they are. So a lot of this has sort of been normalized in our culture, and I can't say our culture, many cultures. We're all different cultures listening to this, I'm sure. But going back throughout time, there has been the way I'll say personal trauma healing works is that when there is a traumatic experience, and we don't have the capacity to process it at that time, it stays stuck in our system energetically and in the nervous system until we are at a stage at which that trauma can now heal. Sometimes it bubbles up on its own and has lots of different symptoms, and then we're working with trying to heal it. And sometimes we choose to heal it. We choose to go back and work with it. But that complexity of that trauma is buried deep, and we ideally would come to a point where we would heal it through different modalities, mindfulness, breath work, therapy, awareness, moving the energy through the body, all different types of therapies. Those are the ones I'm most intimately connected to. But ideally, then we come to a repair. And in that repair process, there's acknowledgement, there's recognition, there's an awareness that it occurred. But in the repair process, we find that we are no longer stuck in the trauma. It doesn't take hold of us. We can't say it didn't happen, but what we can say now is, I am not that. I am not that trauma anymore. I am me, and I had that experience. And I am no longer in a place where that experience is running the story through my body and, speaking the behaviors or triggering my behaviors and my coping mechanisms, etc. Same is true when we're talking about collective history. And I'm still talking about this pie here, this puzzle. In our collective history, if we did not repair trauma on a collective level at a young age, at the time, if there was no recognition, taking responsibility, acknowledgement, efforts to heal or repair, a mass experience, it stays stuck in our collective system, just like it would in our own personal systems until later. And then it starts to bubble up, it starts to surface, and there's opportunity for healing that history should we choose to do it. So I'm naming that because part of the division that we feel is our relationship to the collective history, coupled with our own personal history, coupled with our normalizations of how we deal with history, shoving it under the rug, disassociating, not acknowledging it, not suppressing and blaming and shaming, making the other person wrong, all of those ways in which we would normalize how to work with history inside our for our own being, but also on a collective level. So if we're talking about politics, specifically related to the United States, we have complex trauma in our history. We have complex history. We have complex emotions in relation to that history. And all of that feeds into what is bubbling up for people personally. And in energy healing and in energy work specifically and spiritually, every time a collective trauma is triggered and raised to the surface, our personal wounds, our personal traumas get triggered. Then it becomes our responsibility to look at what personally is being triggered inside of us instead of shaming, blaming, making the other wrong. The way in which we heal division is the ability, and this isn't quick, nor is it easy, but the way in which we do it is about being willing to see the other side, being willing to acknowledge that everyone has a trauma profile or a history or a belief or relationship with their past that we might not have walked in those shoes. We can only once we can walk in someone else's shoes, we can have a compassion and understanding for what they might have experienced or lived through. But ultimately, the way in which we can extend across the division is by simply being willing to understand where somebody is and their deeper why behind what's occurring. Now, some people may not know that themselves. They may not have done that deeper work. They may not have that deeper. They may not have that deeper consciousness or even intention to be able to heal and go into places that, where history lives. And they may not even have a desire to bridge the divide. And we also need to have an understanding of that. We cannot control other people. We never will be able to. We can be disappointed at others' actions or limitations or their behaviors or their beliefs. We can have our own ability to set our boundaries. We can have our own beliefs. We can provide our own protection. We can do a lot of things for ourselves, but we can't necessarily control the other being, particularly as an adult, if they are an adult. The way in which, when there is the divide occurring, when you have that moment of, wow, this person really, we are so on different planets. And we realize in that moment, there is a separation. There is no connection here. We are not connected. And sometimes if it's family members, then we are connected on some level, but we just experienced a moment of disconnection. That cord is not connected in this moment between our hearts, because at this moment, I'm starting to feel something else. So again, to move through that division moment, we have to lead ourselves through it. So here is how to lead yourself through the division. First of all, and I'm going to say this too, what I'm going to say is not easy to do. And it takes a ton of practice and a lot of patience. And you may get 2 of these steps and you might not get the rest of them. And maybe the next time you get 3 steps out of it. No major expectations of perfection here. I'm going to name them as practice. This is what we're trying to do to start to shift the ability for us to stay connected with ourselves in relation to another who has a very different point of view or way of being. Number 1, when you initially have that awareness of shock, or you have that awareness of we're separate, we're different, we think differently. That is the moment to acknowledge that that is a shock. There is a shock in that moment. And in that shock, there is confusion. There is the awareness that we are separate. And there is a division that's starting to happen. We are disconnected. So starting to just notice that step. There's a moment of shock. In that shock feeling, and it's a moment. Shock is a moment, and that moment could be 3 seconds, or it can be 2 days. It can be 5 days. I mean, there's no timeline here, but shock is a freeze experience, and in it, a lot of things come up. Number 1, or I should say number 2 here, in the shock, there can be emotions, and those emotions might be immediate. Maybe grief, anger, fear, all could surface at the exact same time. Or anger could be the first one. And we're angry because deep down, there's grief in the separation. Or we're angry because we just realized that this person is not on the same page. We are not together, and there's fear in that. So in that moment of shock, there is an emotional surface. The complex emotions just surfaced. Then in that moment, when we have shock and emotion, there is a trigger, and a trigger is a regression to a prior experience buried in the system in our body. It can be a memory, unconsciously or subconsciously. It can be a feeling in the body. It can be a body memory or a deeper emotion, but it is a regressed moment. Shock, the emotions, the trigger, which is a regression. Quick, very quick. We're living the past in the present moment in a second, in a split second. So those are the experiences that are happening in that moment of realization. Now, our responsibility in this divide is to take responsibility for the fact that we are in a trigger in that moment. Holy cow, I am triggered. The anger is going to want to blame and shame and argue and go through all the points and the talking heads and the reasons why and all of those things. But that's going to create the combat and the argument and make the division wider. And I'll add in here that it doesn't mean a conversation can't happen. It's just a conversation coming from a more compassionate, heart-centered, grounded place could land differently than one that is coming out of shock or a deeper trigger. So in that moment, we have to take responsibility for the fact that we are triggered. They are not the problem. They're stating their perspective. We are now having the feeling. So in that, here's how we lead ourselves through that. Number one, now you might not be able to do it in the moment in front of somebody. So you could say, "Ooh, I'm recognizing that I've got a lot bubbling up. We're going to divert this conversation. I'd like to pause on this." We're not saying we're sweeping it under the rug, repeating, those coping mechanisms on how we deal with history, but we're willing to say in this moment, I've got to take care of myself in order to figure out my next step with this individual or with many individuals. So here's what you do. Okay, now you're in your own space, and here's how you lead yourself through it. So number one is you ask yourself, what is being triggered in me? Is it an emotion, or is there a deeper feeling? What is the emotion that's happening here? So what is it? So you close your eyes, take some deep breaths, and then feel into where that emotion might be existing. Your emotion might be the thread into where it is in your body. So if it's anger or if it's grief, then you tie it into where it lives in your body. Take some deep breaths there. Then you can ask yourself, after a little bit of breathing into it, how old is this? How long has this anger, grief, fear been here? How old is it? Now, the frontal lobe of the brain might not be where your answer comes from. Your answer might come from your heart or a deeper place inside you. It might come from your body. This is where we have different ways in which our intuition speaks to us. We might see a picture, we might hear a word, we might get a body sensation, we might get a felt sense. So when you can now say, oh, this is really old. This is deep. This is going back down to, a past experience where I've also felt this level of division. Now, here is where you would start breathing into the energy you have held, that you have compressed, that you might have suppressed deep in the layers of your complex system. It's not really the other person, even if it's related to the other person. You are saying, I'm taking responsibility for this, and I'm going to start breathing through it. So you breathe through, give breath to that emotion and to the perhaps the situation around that emotion. Maybe there's a memory, maybe there's just a body sensation. Maybe you have no idea where it originated. But when you feed breath into an area of your body where the emotion is stored, you are clearing energy. And you're doing so because the cells in that area of the body are holding the energetic imprint. And so when you breathe into that area of your body, you're saying, oh, my breath is my soul, and my soul needs to take up space in this area where this old emotion is living. And so I'm going to breathe into it and breathe my light, breathe my soul into that space and start to let this old feeling release. This is a form of processing emotions. Now, with that, is there a story connected to it? Maybe. Would it be helpful to journal on that? Absolutely, that could be helpful. Would it be helpful to kind of speak something out loud? Maybe so. That's all forms of processing the energy that's held in that area of the body. Ultimately, what you're doing is that you are bridging the divide within yourself. You are saying, I have been disconnected from this old imprint in my body. And this situation, this conversation with this person has now been a teacher, a healer, a guide back into myself to now start to heal, clear, and release an old history in my body so that I can bridge that divide by creating connection inside myself. When that energy releases, and I like the image of sending it down my grounding cord if it's in my lower body, or if it's out, just breath to help release that energy. Then what you can do is start to feel your soul and your light and your breath start to take up space where that energy was. And in that moment, you are increasing consciousness. You are becoming more grounded. You might feel more peaceful. You might feel more space, or you might feel lighter inside yourself. You might feel like you can stretch and expand more. You might feel a little more energy inside yourself. But ultimately, what you're doing in this moment is reconnecting a part of you that was separate or that was divided or disconnected from a deeper, truer, grounded, more aligned part of you, more of your soul. So as you start to fill into that space and become more connected and whole in that area of the body, what you're doing is you are increasing your emotional resilience. You are increasing your capacity to be able to stay present with yourself in relation to the other person. Plus, you are coming current. You are moving forward in time. You have moved from past to present inside your body in that moment. No longer are you living with a pocket of energy that regresses you back to the past. Now, this expansion and presence of yourself brings you in the present moment. And in the present moment, when we are present energetically inside ourselves, we have the ability to stay sourced internally to where hearing someone who has an opposing view may not necessarily disconnect us, may not necessarily form the trigger that's going to throw us back, may not necessarily be emotionally upheaving. It doesn't mean we need to agree or that our values are the same. It doesn't mean that you're right, they're wrong, they're right, you're wrong. All it really means is I'm not abandoning myself in this moment. In this moment, I am staying fully grounded and present inside ourselves. And when we do that, the words that come out of our mouth, the consciousness we speak from or communicate from shifts. We might surprise ourselves with how we stay present and what we speak in that particular moment. So leading ourselves through a divide is about leading ourselves through our own internal division and embodying more of our deeper wholeness and our presence. And I like to think of it, if this helps, it's like the bridge between our upper body and our lower body. A lot of our history is below the belt. A lot of our wounds, our soul history, and our power are from the waist down. And upwards from the waist up is where we have a lot of, that's where a lot of our consciousness sometimes resides. And sometimes we disconnect from the history in our lower body and we're operating fully in the upper half. But us learning to access places and pockets below the belt that might be carrying some history is a way to drop our soul's light deeper into our body and say, I can stay present here. I can stay in my power. I can shift into my a deeper sense of compassion and empathy and presence, because I can have compassion and empathy for myself in this moment. Whereas before I was operating on a regression, on an old past wound. So this is a way in which to think about how are we going to, again, manage, heal the division. It's a big one on the collective level. Will we see that in this lifetime, in your lifetime? I have no idea. But we have to live with ourselves, and we are in charge of how we want to be in relationship with other people. So it becomes our work to lead ourselves through being in relationship with ourselves in a healthy and grounded and connected way that increases more compassion and resilience and capacity to be able to be with others. And I'll add one more little thing about this, which is that it's an important one. When we are grounded, when we are connected, we radiate something that has impact in a good way on other people without even saying a word. So we can walk into a room and that cell peptide receptor relationship between cells and peptides in a cellular experience will communicate, and people will feel something about you in being grounded and centered and connected. Maybe they even sense, ooh, that person, they're in their power somehow. Maybe they don't even have a language for that, but they're in their center, they're in their power. Maybe I won't rock the boat. Maybe I won't talk about, divisive things, or maybe, it has a shift. It has an effect on them just by you staying grounded and connected. And that is a way in which we can help the collective healing, is by, again, you doing your deeper healing and allowing that to radiate out and have its energetic ripple, because it will. So I hope this supports you. I hope it helps you in your life right now. Anytime you're around people where this type of conversation becomes difficult, I hope it gives you a guideline to support you and how to stay connected with yourself and healing and leading yourself through the divide. All right. And until next time, we'll see you soon.